Hi, everyone. Today, we're going to talk about an often overlooked but incredibly powerful primitive and building block for the web, and that's consumer data portability. My name is Reed McGinley-Stempel, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Stytch, which is an authentication API company that makes it simple for developers to build better sign-up and login flows. I spent most of my career obsessed with two different topics that are inherently intertwined: authentication and data access. Prior to starting Stytch, I led user authentication at a company called Plaid, which builds integrations to thousands of banks so that end users can provision their data to third-party applications like Venmo, Coinbase, Chime, Robinhood, et cetera. And during my experience leading authentication there's two convictions I gained around data portability. The first one is that data portability is an often overlooked key building block for innovation on the internet. What we found at Plaid was that when you enable the ability for users to provision data out of a silo, like their bank account, you can create an entire industry. Prior to the existence of Plaid and tools like that in the United States, we did not have the industry of fintech or the ability for apps like Venmo, Coinbase, Square, et cetera, to compete with the legacy financial institutions that our data was welded to. The second key conviction that we gained was that if you enable developers to build on top of consumer data portability, you can provide significantly better consumer outcomes. As an example, what we found at Plaid is that once you opened up the ability to share financial data, lenders, banks, financial management tools had to compete on user experience, economics, and the actual value that they're providing to the end user in order to convince them to use their tools. And if you think about industries today that are still lagging behind data portability, some of the major ones that impact our lives every day are things like healthcare, where it's difficult for us to actually port the data that would allow third-party apps to provide us preventative guidance, better health insights, and ultimately allow us to lead better lives. The other thing that we found while building for data portability and building authentication when it came to financial data access was that user friction plays an enormous role in consumer outcomes. This is maybe not surprising to many of us, but we as humans are very friction averse. We're likely to go through with something if we think that there's a dopamine hit on the other side, but we're much less likely to do the things that we know we probably should do, whether that's eating our vegetables or in the data and application space, sharing our data, going through friction online to provide ourselves with experiences that are better for ourselves. An example that I like to use here is that something that we found when users were provisioning their financial data to applications is that roughly half as many users were willing to go through the friction of sharing their data with a tool that was healthy for them, such as a budgeting app, than were willing to go through it for something that was more exciting and risk-seeking, like buying Bitcoin for the first time or trading stock options. And the most significant source of drop-off that we found on the user connection step was users forgetting their password. And the user research that we did found that most users were not willing to go through the friction of a 2 to 3 minute password reset flow if there wasn't a dopamine hit on the other side. And so today, I want to talk about three major things that shape data portability and that we should keep in mind as we build in both Web 2 and Web 3. The first is that data portability issues create significant costs for both users and businesses. And if we want better data portability, there's two major things that we need to do. The first is that we need fewer walled gardens where our data is siloed within applications and industries that don't want us to share that data. And two, we need to remove the excessive user friction in the actual provisioning flow. And then finally, I want to talk about how Web 3 offers a glimpse at some new ways around data architecture that can allow us in Web 2 to rethink data portability. Data portability's frustrations and issues that we experience range from the mundane to the profound. On the mundane side, if you think about every day when you log into your laptop and you log into your browser, or you just open up your browser, you have a wealth of knowledge and data underneath each of those experiences. Your Apple account and your Google account know more about you likely than any family member, doctor or therapist ever could. But the amount of data that we can actually share on those accounts to different third-party applications is actually quite narrow. And on the mundane side, some of the ways that this manifests is that as you browse the web and the internet, you'll find that it can feel quite dumb at times. Even though you're logged into this powerful tool that knows so much about your iCloud account or your Google account, every time you go to a new site, you're re-entering the same information, the same 5 to 10 fields to create an account, share your data, and this is where user friction produces 2 big issues. The first is surmountable. It's frustration. If the only problem was frustration, we could live with this as a scenario. But the problem is that we find is that when users are faced with frustration, they stop doing the things that are good for them and focus more on the dopamine hits, whether that's buying clothes, buying a new phone, etc. It becomes significantly harder to do things we don't naturally want to do, like managing our finances, booking a healthcare appointment, or generally just making sure that we're keeping up to date on all of the things that we should be doing. But on the more profound side, the thing that I find most frustrating about consumer data portability in the current state is the fact that there's so much data that could powerfully improve our lives that we do not have the ability to even provision if we wanted to. I wanted to share this quote from Eli Wachs, who's the CEO of a company called Footprint, which is a data portability company. He shares a little bit of the context on why he's so obsessed with data portability and thinks it should be a first-class citizen on the internet. And the example that he shares is his frustration when he learned that a family member's diagnosis with Parkinson's could have been forecasted years earlier if certain data that Google held was actually provisionable in a way that the user could have provided it to third-party applications. Because some of the data that Google has on all of us that can predict cognitive decline and related diseases are things like declined ability to solve CAPTCHAs over time. They know what our baseline and what our benchmark is, typos over time, and other relevant data of that sort. The problem, though, is not that Google is necessarily evil. It's that Google does allow us to share a lot of data, such as our calendar, our contacts, et cetera, but there's a lot of data that doesn't fit onto their product roadmap that we emit over time that they do not allow us to provision later on. And so if you take nothing else from this talk, the one thing that I feel extremely passionate about is that better data portability can help us live healthier and wealthier lives. But even if you're thinking about it from a business context, it's not just consumers that get a raw deal from poor data portability. Today, the cost of customer acquisition continues to skyrocket, particularly with new changes to iOS. And as the cost increases, you have to think about what are direct lines of impact to your CAC as a business. And one of the major ones is user drop-off once you actually pay to get somebody to your site. And the reason people typically drop off is because they're exposed to too significant a friction. You're asked to fill out those 5 to 10 fields in order to create that account. And so data portability doesn't just have a human cost, it also has a business cost that's baked in. As you see that typically a significant double-digit percentage of users will not go through with a sign-up flow if there's too many fields or too much friction involved. And so there are 3 key things that are stunting data portability today. The first is capability. Is it actually possible for me to programmatically share the data I want to? Today, there's a lot of data in Google, Apple, et cetera, that we just cannot share, even if you go through an open authorization flow. The second is friction. Does the flow to revision the data excessively place the burden on the consumer to figure out how to share that data? And the final one is incentive. Is there actually sufficient value on the other side for the user to provision that data? If you look at the evolution of data architectures over time and the web, it makes sense why we're in a suboptimal place. In the 1990s, we got our first mainstream graphical user interface, and so we were able to browse the web. But most websites were read-only. We would look at a blog post, and we didn't have a need to store or retrieve data. Now, fast forward to the end of the 90s, early 2000s, we start seeing more read-write applications, where we can actually store information about ourselves, such as our interests, our personal identifying information, our payment information, and other fields like that. And so at this point in the 2000s, we start getting what I call the data portability problem. Every application builds in a silo the data fields that they want to hold in that application, and they all start building authentication into how you can actually access that account. This is the reason that today, all of us likely have 150 to 200 usernames and passwords that we manage. And much of the data underneath those accounts is not shareable today. Not because those apps don't necessarily want you to share it, but typically it's actually pretty high friction for them to build an OAuth 2 flow to allow you to share it. In the 2010s, we did get some pretty significant innovations as things like sign-in with Google, sign-in with Facebook started to go mainstream. And you got this concept of bring your account. But again, one of the limitations is that you could bring your account with the data fields that those large companies had specifically spec'd out for you to share. What I would posit as the most interesting thing about Web3 is not the tokens, it's not the blockchain in itself, but it's some of the elements around the data architecture where now you can bring your own account across the web with things like wallets, where you're able to solve the 3 core shortcomings that we talked about a minute ago. And those 3 shortcomings that get solved by the Web3 data architecture are first, the capability. Users own more of their data graph. The structured data that you share isn't dependent on whether a company exposes it. And what I mean by that is that this is actually where having a public ledger is helpful. It's the fact that as you interact with Web3 applications and smart contracts and data about you gets written, it's no longer written to a siloed data server. You can actually query it, and the way that you permission it is through a one-click, frictionless, and passwordless flow through your MetaMask or your Phantom wallet. And so that's the other innovation here. The friction approach is near zero. So you can start allowing for better experiences without the user having to necessarily have a dopamine hit on the other side in order to pursue those. And then the final thing is that as you have the building blocks of better capabilities and near zero friction, the incentive models can be rethought. So you can think about if you're an upstart that wants to provide a better experience than someone's bank or their legacy healthcare provider, whatever ossified industry you're dealing with, now you can actually provide the incentives for users to switch over through whatever means or models necessary. And so when I think about the elephant in the room today, data portability in Web3, I think the biggest shortcoming of Web3 today is the fact that it's truly not mainstream. And I don't know when or if Web3 will go mainstream, I'll be honest. But I think that there's significant ways that we should be thinking in Web2 about how we take some of the most impressive data architecture novelties there, the ability to port data more seamlessly to provide us with healthier and wealthier lives, and think through in Web2, what can we do to free user data, be mindful about user friction when somebody shares their data. We've already found that passwords are a really suboptimal way to do this today. And then how do we ultimately think about, as technologists, how do we strive for autopilot modes? How do we take the friction out of users' hands so that the things that feel like chores get taken care of for them? And if we do that, and in order to do that, we need to make sure that data portability is a first-class citizen on the web. If you're interested in chatting more about these topics, you can learn more at Stytch.com. We're obsessed with authentication and data portability. Feel free to reach out. We'd love to engage in conversation about ways to improve both data portability and authentication in Web 2 and Web 3 and beyond. Thank you.